The Biden-Harris administration is being called out for threatening to withhold military aid from Israel if the Jewish state does not address what the administration calls humanitarian assistance into Gaza within 30 days. Now, this threat, revealed through a leaked letter sent by Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to their Israeli counterparts, makes no mention of Hamas leadership stealing and withholding aid into Gaza. Nor does it mention the hostages, including American citizens, still being held by Hamas. We've seen the Biden-Harris administration undermine Israel's war for its existence, but would they place an arms embargo on our ally, especially as many of these munitions are critically needed as the attacks on Israel continue? Joining us now to discuss this, retired Air Force Brigadier General John Teichert. After a distinguished military career, General Teichert retired as the Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of the Air Force for International Affairs, where he led international engagement on behalf of the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Space Force while managing the service's entire security cooperation portfolio. General Teichert, welcome to Washington Watch.
Tony, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So I want to get your reaction to this move by the Biden-Harris administration, given that the Israeli defense mechanism is really dependent in many ways upon U.S. munitions, even when we're looking at their air defense system. What do you make of this?
Tony, I think the word you used earlier is exactly right, that this undermines our friend in Israel at a critical time where they are on the verge of striking back against Iran. And now we continue to undermine them and provide top cover to terrorists and to Iran by making these types of threats that are consistent with the threats we've been making since February when we started talking about red lines in Rafah.
The defense systems that, of course, everyone is very familiar with the Iron Dome, but you have the Arrow, you have David Sling. These are, as you move up to the longer range, the missiles that intercept these ballistic missiles like we saw on October the 1st, these become very expensive. The Arrow missiles, somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million each. What kind of position would this put Israel in if they are not being supplied with the necessary munitions to defend their own country?
Tony, the United States is the #1 arms supplier to Israel for both offensive and defensive systems. And if all of a sudden we cut off that type of support, then now they are left defenseless against this multi-front war that is propagated by Iran. And it also ultimately undermines our credibility as a trusted friend and ally around the world. And I just think it's shameful that for domestic purposes to pander to the audience in places like Michigan that are looking for the Biden-Harris administration to take a tougher line against Israel, that now we're undercutting not just Israel at the verge of the most important moment in their history, which is striking back against Iran, and undercutting our alliance and friendship system around the world.
General, you were an Air Force fighter pilot before moving up in the command structure. Israel, reportedly, this is anonymous sources from the Biden administration gave this information to the Washington Post, that the Israelis have agreed not to hit petroleum manufacturing facilities or nuclear facilities. Does Israel have the capacity to strike nuclear facilities in Iran without U.S.
Tony,
help?
I think 3 weeks ago, the Israeli strike on 2 ports in Yemen demonstrate that they've got the range to have large-scale strike packages reach out to a distance further than Tehran or some of these nuclear sites within Iran. The challenge is that the nuclear systems that we're talking about are very heavily buried, 300 feet or more below ground, and without real tangible help, that it would be very difficult for Israel to strike sufficiently those type of targets. But I do think that it is unwise for the Biden administration to start leaking which targets are off the list for Israel. That just makes it easier for Iran to defend against those strikes. Every option should be on the table, and it should be a surprise ultimately to Iran which targets are struck when Israel decides to do so.
So, General, what assistance would Israel need in order to go after these nuclear facilities, as you've mentioned, are buried deep in the ground?
Exquisite intelligence is the first step, Tony, and that means knowing exactly where the key nodes are to strike, such that it would set back the nuclear program significantly. And then ultimately, the use of some very particular U.S. assets, like deep bunker busting bombs, would be required to ultimately take out these sites. But I think with the exquisite intelligence that we could precisely strike or allow Israel to strike such that it would set back the nuclear program, and Iran would then have to think about what their next step should be, realizing that Israel has escalation dominance right now in this conflict between the two.
The bunker busting bombs, are those not part of the munitions that the Biden administration was slow walking and holding back from Israel?
They aren't, Tony. Those 2,000-pound bombs that the Biden-Harris administration has threatened to hold back from Israel now for months are not the type that could penetrate deep enough to strike some of those heavily buried and protected nuclear sites in Iran. We're talking about U.S.-only capability and things like the massive ordnance penetrator that would enable us to be able to strike that deep. And Israel doesn't have that capability and wouldn't even have that capability if President Biden and Vice President Harris delivered all of the capability that they needed to Israel.
By comparison, General, in Lebanon, in Beirut, where they took out the Hezbollah commander, how deep were those facilities?
Those were tens of feet instead of hundreds of feet. And those 2,000-pound bombs that Biden and Harris have been threatening to withhold from Israel since their red line and Rafah comment are the type of munitions that have been necessary to strike those types of targets of Hezbollah leaders within Lebanon. And just the fact that for the last 8 months, Israel has had to protect itself against these threats from the United States has been shameful and has emboldened Iran and Hezbollah and the Houthis and others, because they know that not only is Israel striking back to protect themselves, but their closest friend is threatening to hold back aid to them at their moment of need.
So General Teichert, what type of munitions might the Biden-Harris administration withhold if Israel does not comply with their demand to get humanitarian aid into Gaza, more humanitarian aid into Gaza?
Tony, that they could pick any of those type of offensive or defensive munitions. The defensive ones, of course, would be the ones that protect them against 181 missile volley like we saw a few weeks ago from Iran. But then all of those offensive capabilities that are necessary for Netanyahu and the Israeli government to fulfill their objectives, which is to destroy Hamas, to recover the hostages, and then to be able to replace 60 to 80,000 Israelis that have been displaced from the north. And without the right number and type of munitions, offensively and defensively, it means that now Israel does not have the capability to fulfill its objectives. And that is, again, a shame on the United States, even to threaten holding back those type of weapons that are necessary for Israel to fulfill its wartime objectives.
General, I would just say if they're withholding defensive weapons like we were talking about with the air defense system, that would be unbelievable that we would do this to our strategic ally in the Middle East. I want to shift just a little bit to this humanitarian aid, where we're actually just this week evidence in Lebanon, southern Lebanon, as they found grenade launchers and weapons and ammunition that Hezbollah was storing for raids into Israel. They found USAID packages, humanitarian aid from the United Nations that the terrorist organizations are taking. I mean, they're doing this in Gaza, they're doing this in Lebanon, but yet the administration says Israel's got to move more in.
No, and I do think, Tony, that the administration is already starting to pat themselves on the back, that Israel is complying with the demands, which just indicates to me that this is all a political maneuver for those domestic audiences for the election. But I do think it is true that authoritarian regimes, and certainly terrorist regimes, don't care about the people in Gaza or in Lebanon. Frankly, I believe that Hezbollah is holding 5.5 million hostages, and those are the Lebanese people. Right. And unfortunately, the United Nations has not enforced UN Resolution 1701 from 2006.
Correct.
And now Israel is actually doing the bidding of the United Nations by driving Hezbollah to the north and de-arming them. And of course, all of the things that Hezbollah and Hamas and the others can get, even from UN agencies, are fair game for them because they don't care about the people that they claim they are supporting in Lebanon or Gaza or elsewhere.
And the U.S. policy is just fueling that. General Teichert, I want to thank you for joining us. Appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Tony.